dokie. Check. How's it going, everybody? You able to hear me? I'm gonna run down and grab a cup of coffee, and then we will get started. We're gonna review the Age of Absolutism today. Age of Absolutism. Stay tuned for a chance to win $5,000 later on in the broadcast. All right, 1 second. All right. So, here we are, another morning. Another morning where, let's see, how many people are here? Ooh, we got 8 people. Holy smokes. Do me a kindness and why don't you comment, and I want to see who's in here just out of curiosity. Got a baby mochi in here. Anyone want to comment? Let's see who's here. All right, now we're talking. Hello, Christine, Dimple, Renee. Palomi's in here. Wow. Yes, I did. I got your Easter rat. I actually responded to it with 3 facepalm emojis, but then I guess it didn't send. So, yeah, but I did get that. Elizabeth, hello. I just got some coffee. It's going well. Nicholas, good to see you. Thank you for the Easter rat, though, Palomi. That was very... Well, I won't say it was thoughtful, but, well, it is kind of thoughtful. Wyatt! Oh, wow. Wyatt wouldn't be the same without you. I miss zero period. Wyatt sits within arm's length of my desk in the morning time in zero period. Always there with bells. Always there on time. Never late. Model student. All right, very good. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. Dual class at 9 for... Oh, you're fine, Christine. Yeah, you're fine. Don't even worry about it. I don't even know if this... Well, it probably will go till 9, but yeah, it's... No worries whatsoever. Well, we are going to jump to it today with talking about absolutism. We have 11 people in here right now, which is nice. So, let me pull this up here. I'm going to actually use the PowerPoint from in class. We're going to talk about a few different things today pertaining to, if you don't remember, absolutism is like the first big scary unit of Euro. And so there's a lot of stuff in the age of absolutism. So I was thinking about actually taking this unit and dividing into two sections so that we review one half of it and then maybe review the other half of it. Because absolutism, there's like so much to talk about with absolutism. There's a few things that stick out more than others, but generally speaking, absolutism tends to be one of those like giant units that you kind of have to parse out a little bit. Let's go to Schoology and get things situated here. Stay tuned for next month's rat surprise. Yes, I will. I'll make sure to keep my eyes peeled for that. I still don't know the story of how that whole thing started. The whole rat thing. I really have no idea. But I have to admit, it's one of the more unique things that I've ever had happen in my teaching career. So Schoology, pulling up this. It's always loads super slow when I'm doing videos. I'm gonna download this old absolutism PowerPoint. So we'll start with, you know what? Maybe we'll start with absolutism, and maybe we'll start with constitutionalism. Actually, let's start with that. I kind of like talking about constitutionalism first, so we'll do that one. Let's start with that. So we'll download this, and then as that's getting ready, okay, thanks Elizabeth, have a great day. So I'm pulling this up here, constitutionalism. I don't think I used this PowerPoint in class, but we're going to use it today. I have a different constitutionalism PowerPoint that I prefer using, but that's okay. We'll just use what we got available to us. So, all right. How is everybody doing? Just out of curiosity, anyone want to? It's nice to be able to interact with folks for the first time in a while. Let's tighten this up here a little bit. How's everybody doing? Good? Any cool stories from what you call it to talk about? Quarantine? Any fun stories at all? You guys sick and tired of your families yet? Fighting with your siblings? Anything like that? Give you a minute to respond here because I'm on a delay. Ooh, Renee had a cup of coffee. Love that. It's like an essential ingredient to my morning. Any other cool stories from quarantine? Nobody's had anything fun going on? What do you guys do all day? Sleep? And then you're up interwebbing all night? Whoa, it's Vig! Hey, Vig! Good to see you. Pretty good. Just been doing work for classes, spending time with my family. Good. Good. That's good to hear. I got Valorant. Valorant? What's Valorant? Is that a game? Oh, I didn't put the link on Schoology. Whoops. Better do that. Maybe that's why we don't have a bunch of people. I must have forgotten to do it. Alright. It's an easy fix. Okay, now we copy that, go over to period 2, updates, drop this in here, boom, go to period 4, go to updates, drop this in here, boom, nice, alright, what do we got here? I miss calling you old in class. It was the highlight of my year. Yes, well, you can still call me old on the YouTube chat. Sibling Rivalry Day 33. Yeah, God, tell me about it. I got attacked at Walmart and people took stuff out of our carts. Are you serious, Dinton? What the heck? I've been watching Netflix like all day. Yeah, I know that struggle. Imagine having siblings, yeah. I have been watching troll videos of the quarantine. Nice. Good. Pretty much what I've been doing is hanging out at my house. I've played some music, although I haven't done much music this week. I've been kind of taking a little bit of a mental break from music because it takes a lot of energy. And I've been focusing more on getting stuff going for distance instruction and stuff like that this week. So I've been doing a lot of stuff relating to work recently. I do a lot of hanging out at my computer and watching the cat sit on the speaker next to my desk. That's pretty much what my day entails, drinking coffee and watching Mochi sit on my speaker. Pretty much we just sit there for hours. It's an exciting life, but, you know, what can you say? Well, folks, let's go ahead and get started talking about constitutionalism. It is 8:15. We got 12 people in here. Maybe I should text back Samuel. I have added the link just in case he didn't see that. And I'm going to put this over onto desktop view. All right, constitutionalism. Is government power limited by an agreement of some sort? This is why Walmart be scary. Walmart do be scary. It do be scary. So, anyhow. So constitutionalism. When we talk about a constitution, probably the first thing that comes to mind is like an old, document, and like a piece of paper, right? And the Constitution that they signed back in the olden days in Britain is kind of a similar thing. But you have to remember that constitutions, these written documents, in a lot of places in Europe, people don't look at constitutions as having any real binding authority. Constitutions are simply words written on paper. Now, to the British, to the English before they become the British, the English are really big on contracts, okay? If it's written down, the British view written word as like the gospel, okay? So they put a huge emphasis on writing. But these written constitutions have a tendency to be deals brokered between high nobles and the monarch. And what these constitutions typically do, it's not the same as our Constitution. See, when we think about constitutions of modern times after the Enlightenment, we're thinking about things like, freedom of speech or freedom of religion or whatever. Really, our Constitution, though, is pretty rare in that aspect of things. Most places in the world don't guarantee freedom of speech, and they didn't do that back in this time, certainly. They also didn't grant things like freedom of religion or whatever else. So there's a delicate balance between the power of government and the rights and liberties of individuals. And when we talk about constitutionalism in the 1600s or constitutionalism in the 1700s, the type of constitutionalism that we're talking about is really more of an agreement between, it's an agreement between like the king and the high nobles. When we talk about individual rights, we're not talking about the rights of the individuals like common everyday people. We're talking about people who are high nobles in government, in the House of Lords, for example, or the House of Commons in Parliament in England at that time. And the constitution that they had was typically to try to reduce the king's ability to govern by decree and simply raise taxes arbitrarily whenever he wanted to. And so these constitutions that are being written at this time are kind of different than the constitutions that we have, that we think of in modern day times, that secure like Republican style government where you have representative government and a democratic process. Moving on, English society in the 1600s. Capitalism does play a major role in the high degree of social mobility. At this time, you have a group of wealthy landowners in the countryside who dominate the House of Commons, and they're called gentry. And this word gentry usually refers to kind of like high middle class, lower upper class folks. These gentry tend to be commercially successful. They moved from the middle class into the upper class, but they're borderline folks. They're not going to be like earls or barons or people like that. They're going to be people who own a piece of land, but it's probably going to be comparatively somewhat small, but they might be relatively successful and have, a farm or whatever, and make money on that farm. But remember that capitalism as a function of economics is limited to only a certain segment of the population at this time. Most people in England don't have the opportunity for, land, labor, capital, all the ingredients that go into capitalistic endeavors until much later on. It's really just the kind of capitalism that we're talking about this time isn't going to be like factory capitalism in the 1600s. Remember that this is a pre-industrial revolution time that we're talking about here. So the kind of capitalism that we're talking about is going to be like cash crop farming, all right, or growing wool or sheep specifically, and that kind of thing, but also maybe other farms too. But generally speaking, the farms in England, if you could, you wanted sheep on them because English wool was known to be very good quality wool for one reason or another. I don't have a great reason for that. Hello, Sravanti, good to see you. Good morning. So many of the gentry had been commercially successful. They rely heavily on legal precedent to limit the power of the king on economic and political matters. Now, when we use that word precedent, remember that doesn't have anything to do with presidents, okay? Precedent refers to a practice that was put into place in the past, and because it happened in the past, there's a precedent for it, meaning it's happened before, so it's we're going to try and keep this practice the same. And so when we talk about, like, for example, the Supreme Court, in modern day times, what the Supreme Court will do is they will take a case that they're working on, they'll look at previous case law to see that were similar cases to the one that they're working on, and they'll say, well, how did the Supreme Court in the past, say 10, 50, 100 years ago, deal with this similar case, all right? And based on how they dealt with that case, they use that previous precedent to determine how they're going to operate in this one. Well, gentry of this time do very much the same thing. They look at the common practices of the land, and you go back to, for example, in England, there in 1215 there was a document called the Magna Carta that was signed by King John. He was forced to sign it. It's not like he wanted to, but it limited the king's rights to be able to tax arbitrarily. And so this would be an example of legal precedent that the gentry would have relied heavily on in brokering a constitutional agreement with the king that divvies power between, or divides power between Parliament and the king. Taxation at this time. Unlike France, there's really no stigma to paying taxes in England, because in England the tax situation is more equitable. The peasantry isn't as heavily exploited in England as they are in France for taxation purposes. And we talked about this first semester, talking about the role that taxation plays in society. It's a funny thing to talk a little bit more about that, just to give you a little bit more context. It's an interesting thing, the way that the peasantry works between France and England. For being so close to one another geographically, they actually are very different from one another in terms of the roles that peasants play in terms of the economy and in society at large. For all of the faults of France, we'll say, for all of the faults of France and the problem that they have with taxing the peasants to a burdensome level, by the time that the French Revolution breaks out, especially the third estate is taxed so ridiculously unfairly. You probably remember that from the French Revolution unit going back to before Christmas time. But for all of the faults about that system, the thing that's really interesting is that because the peasants in France were taxed so heavily, it actually meant that their position in society was much more secure in an odd way. Vulnerable in the sense that they're economically vulnerable, from the sense that they're being taxed to a huge degree, but oddly secure in another sense, because the French peasant population, the state relies so heavily on the peasants for taxation that it actually in some case kind of insulates their position in society. So you see fewer peasants leave France, not only because they can't, but also because the French government doesn't have a vested interest. Excuse me. The French government doesn't have a vested interest in sending these folks out of the country to settle in the colonies elsewhere. And so in England, even though the tax situation is a little bit more equitable, at that same time, while it's more equitable, in some sense, the position of peasants in England is actually a little bit more vulnerable, because the peasants in England weren't so heavily relied on by the state to support everything. So they're not as much of a necessity as they were in France. And so anyhow, people in England are generally, particularly the gentry, they're going to be willing to pay taxes so long as the House of Commons has a say in what those taxes are spent on. But they're okay. In England, they're oddly kind of okay with paying taxes. It's not like they love doing it. No one likes paying taxes. They just want to have a say in how those taxes are spent. And when I say they, I'm talking specifically to the gentry, the kind of these kind of like lower upper class people, or that's kind of a weird way of saying it, but people of the lowest rung of the upper class, I would say, would be the best way to describe them. Religion. Calvinists comprised perhaps the largest percentage of the population by the early 17th century. Puritans were, of course, seeking to purify the church, and they wanted to get rid of the Catholic elements of the Church of England, which was highly resemblant of the Catholic Church. They believe in something called Protestant work ethic, and we talked about that a couple of classes ago, or a couple of YouTube videos ago, talking about how the Protestants believed that working hard and God, and then being rewarded for that work here on earth was a sign that God was happy with your work. Problems facing English monarchs at this time. The Stuarts were restrained by the growth of Parliament. You have two major issues facing the English kings at this time, particularly the Stuart Dynasty. Now, if you recall the Stuart Dynasty, let's just take a minute here to talk a bit about the Stuart Dynasty. Oh, look at that. That's Harrison in the background. Harrison's sleeping in the sun. Boy, Harrison loves. He's a little sun cat. He loves laying in the sun. Now, let's talk a little bit about this. So, the Stuart Dynasty, for those of you that don't remember, the Stuart Dynasty tried to rule England using divine right, particularly the first two Stuart kings, which were James I and Charles I. And those two guys attempted to institute an absolutist style of rule in England, which frankly didn't fit too well with the British way of doing things up to that point. The British way of doing things was that there was kind of a working relationship between the monarch, who prior to James I had been Elizabeth for a long time. There was a working relationship between the nobles and the monarch in terms of what goes on, taxation-wise, politically, and so on. When they come in, the Stuart Dynasty in particular comes in, James I, if you recall, he's got some issues. James I he's trying to rule with divine right. He's an alcoholic. He comes from Scotland, so he's perceived as a foreigner. Okay, he like spits when he talks. He's just not very he's not a very kingly king, and this doesn't rest well with the English nobles at the time. They're looking at him like, oh God, honestly, do we have to deal with this guy? He's the worst, right? He spits when he talks. He's got like a speech impediment or something, and he's like an alcoholic, so he's always drooling on himself. It's really disgusting. He's supposed to be this king, and he's just absolutely horrible, right? So these parliamentarians, they don't really care much for the Stuart Dynasty. Now, you would think that things would get better when James I dies and Charles takes over, but because Charles was not good friends with his dad, they didn't get along very well. He comes in and kind of takes all the worst qualities that his dad had and makes it even harder for Parliament to like him. And when I say the worst qualities, what I'm actually talking about is the divine right side of things. He's just really obstinate. He doesn't want to deal with Parliament at all. He doesn't want to share his power. He views himself as a divine ruler. And these sorts of things are going to make them difficult for parliamentarians to get along with. So, Cervantes asks a question down here. It says, in terms of quality of life, was it the same for the English and French peasants, or was it different for the French peasants because of their position in society? That's a good question. Probably in terms of quality of life, I would imagine that the French peasants, well, that depends on how you phrase it. My answer to that question is this. As time goes on, my guess is that the position within French society for the peasants was probably, believe it or not, until the eve of the French Revolution, when there's like that mini ice age and then all the crops start dying and people are starving. Until that point, probably the French peasants' lives are a bit better. And that's because they're less expendable. So it's hard to scratch out a living as a peasant in England over time, because as the time goes on, the agricultural revolution sets in. And when the agricultural revolution sets in, you see tremendous population growth, but you also see people forced off their lands in favor of new agricultural techniques and the enclosure system. So as time goes on, I would say that probably the lives of English peasants, because they were more vulnerable, made their lives a little bit more difficult and unpredictable, where the French peasants' lives, while they were burdened tremendously with taxes, if nothing else, their position in society was at least somewhat secure, because the French state needed them. And like I say, that comment, I think, is true up until there's hunger problems in France, in which case I would say the French peasants' lives probably get worse, because anytime that you add famine to a situation, it's going to make your life much, much more difficult. So that's my answer, Shivanti. Now, moving on. Talking about constitutionalism. Could the king govern without the consent of Parliament? In this time, you might recall that Charles the First of England dismisses Parliament for an extended period of time prior to the start of the English Civil War. Presbyterians, who are Calvinists from Scotland, Puritans, Calvinists from England, and Congregationalists favored Parliament, whereas Anglicans and Catholics tended to favor the king. Anglicans, a little bit more moderate, a little bit more conservative. Presbyterians, Puritans, Congregationalists, these are going to be more radical, all right? Would the church government follow the existing hierarchical episcopal form or assume a more Presbyterian form? Remember at this time that the English monarch is in fact also not only just the King of England, but the head of the church. And so because he's the head of the church, the question is the church going to continue having the same episcopal form that it had before, or are they going to change the hierarchy of the church to have it be more resemblant of a Calvinist structure? So where we get to James I, no bishop nor no king, in response to Calvinist desires to eliminate the church. So he is not going to be a fan of eliminating the church, okay? The Church of England. Now keep in mind too that because James I comes from Scotland, he's probably going to be a little bit more sympathetic to the Catholics than a lot of English folks are going to be. So he believes in the divine right of kings. This is his sympathy towards the Anglican Church and towards Catholicism are going to mean that James I is going to be viewed skeptically by a lot of the more radical Puritans in Parliament at this time. He twice dissolves Parliament over issues of taxation and parliamentary demands of free speech. Remember, they didn't even have free speech in Parliament at that time prior to the English Civil War. Elizabeth I had left behind a large debt for England, so he's got that problem to deal with. And then there was a series of wars, including the 30 Years' War, which starts halfway through his reign, or two-thirds of the way through his reign. A series of wars were very costly and required large government revenues. Remember, too, at this time, that England and Scotland are not formed into Great Britain yet. So Scotland is a potential invader from the north who could cause problems to England as well, and they do down the line. James unwisely flaunted his wealth. He kind of damages the prestige of the monarchy, and he's replaced by his son Charles. Like that of James, he claimed the theory of divine right led him to have absolute power as king. And remember, that whole idea of divine right is because I'm king, God gave me the power to rule. Parliament also at this time is seeking to diminish Charles's influence, just like they did with James. And Charles is trying to control the Church of England. Tax issues pitted Charles I against Parliament because Charles needed money for waging wars. But he can't just tell English parliamentarians to start paying more money any old time that he wants. To save money, soldiers get quartered in English homes during wartime. People hated that. And by the way, as a side note, that idea of quartering soldiers in people's homes is a major factor during the American Revolutionary War. Leading up to the American Revolution, there were several different laws that were passed. One of them was called the Quartering Act, that forced American colonials to house English soldiers. And of course they hated that, because that means that you're basically welcoming a total stranger into your house. Just because they're a soldier doesn't necessarily mean that they're a nice person. So to save money, soldiers get quartered in English homes. Some English nobles were arrested for refusing to lend money to the government, and by 1628 both houses of Parliament, both the House of Lords and the House of Commons, were firmly opposed to King Charles I. There's a law that he passes in 1628, or a law that, not that he passes, but that Parliament passes rather, called the Petition of Right. And the Petition of Right was, basically it's a petition. You guys know what a petition is. It's where a bunch of people come together and they sign on a document that says that we all stand for this particular whatever thing. And so the Petition of Right was in 1628, where Parliament attempted to encourage Charles to grant basic legal rights in return for tax increases. Now, the provisions of the Petition of Right of 1628 said that, number one, only Parliament has the right to levy taxes. The king can't do it. Number two, no one should be imprisoned without due process of law. We still use that today. Everybody has the right to habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the idea that the person should be present in court. Okay, it basically means like present the body, if I remember right. And so yeah, this is all, yeah, that's absolutely right, Stravanti. So these are sorts of the sorts of things that you can see set a precedent for the kinds of rights that Englishmen become known for, and eventually get passed down to America, which is in many cases kind of the baby brother of England. After the colonial period. So no forced quartering of soldiers in homes or of private citizens, and then martial law could not be declared in peacetime. And by the way, I have seen a whole bunch of posts recently where people are spelling martial law M-A-R-S-H-A-L-L. Okay, that is not how you say, that's not how it's spelled. It's spelled martial like this. Okay, it's also not marital law. Marital law is it's a type of law about marriages and divorces. Okay, martial law is completely different. That's where the military is administering justice, basically. Charles dissolved Parliament in 1629 after the Petition of Right, because Parliament continued to refuse increased taxation without its consent. And it had also demanded that any movement of the government towards Catholicism or Arminianism is like Calvinism light, be treated as treason. So, we're seeing a huge divide between Charles and Parliament at this time. So this is where we enter into a time where Charles rules basically without Parliament for about 11 years. And so he rules essentially as an absolute monarch, but he still can't just go and steal people's money from them. So the way that he does this is he raised money using medieval forms of taxation. Those with wealth basically had to pay, and he comes up with this old law that people had forgotten about a long time ago called ship money, and I think you probably remember that. That's the one where he required people to pay the outfit of ships that weren't even living in coastal communities. And so he goes back and he collects all this back pay from this ship tax that had not been collected from a bunch of people for a long time. Because previous to that, it had only been collected from coastal communities where ships actually, were. Give me 1 second. Excuse me. Sorry, I just had to blow my nose really quick. Okay, so ship money. Religious persecution of Puritans became the biggest reason, though, for the English Civil War. And I don't need to go over the entire English Civil War with you, but to give you just a brief rundown here of what goes on. You have this period of time called Short Parliament in 1640. So there was the Scottish military had been invading northern England at this time. And the reason that Charles has started to get nervous is because the England is being invaded and they need to mount a defensive force if they don't want to be, overrun by the Scots. So the Scottish military revolt in response to Charles's attempt to impose the English Common Book of Prayer on the Scottish Presbyterian Church results in the Short Parliament. And so Charles needs new taxes for war, and so the Scots are now coming down due to this whole Book of Common Prayer thing. Parliament reconvened in 1640, but still refused taxes. And so, here's what he did. This Short Parliament is a reference to the fact that they only met for 1 month. And so he calls them as like an emergency, like, look, the Scots are like literally already here. We need to mount a defense against the Scots because I tried to force an English Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Presbyterian Church and they didn't like it. And Parliament's like, okay, you're an idiot. And he promised that he would keep calling them together, but he doesn't, and he dismisses them again after only 1 month. That's what really causes problems. And so the Long Parliament comes after the Short Parliament. This happens shortly later. Long Parliament is where Charles was desperate for revenue again. Once again, he agrees to Parliament's demands because this time they're like, Parliament, believe it or not, Parliament really would rather work with the king. They just want it known that their concerns are heard. And it's in some sense Charles's obstinance to listening to anyone in Parliament or having this body of representatives check his power in any sort of way. It's his really bitter refusal to work with them that angers them so much. They really would much rather be working with the king. Because historically, when the king has come to Parliament and said, look, we need money for a war, Parliament can get behind that so long as they feel like you're spending the money the right way and that the war is justified. So, Parliament's demands after Long Parliament was that they could not be dissolved without its consent. They must meet at least once every 3 years, which is really not asking that much because now Parliament in modern day times meets very regularly because it's like a regular job of governance. But ship money got also abolished. That was one of their demands. And those who persecuted Puritans were to be tried and executed. And also they wanted Star Chamber abolished. Remember, Star Chamber was set up by Henry VII going all the way back to the start of the Tudor Dynasty in the late 1400s. Star Chamber was that inner council where the king could essentially individually hold these tribunals that would determine people's fates. Common law courts were supreme to the king's courts, and then to refuse funds to raise an army to defeat the Irish. So a long session of Parliament, with Charles in the center. Here you can see the parliamentarians standing around. And then the Puritans became the majority in Parliament against the king's Anglican supporters. So, how does the English Civil War break out? Well, basically the immediate cause of it is that Charles tries to arrest several of the more radical Puritan members of Parliament who didn't like the king's more conservative Anglican position. But a crowd came to these Puritans' defense, and Parliament had been unwilling to give the king an army to put down this Irish rebellion as well, and that was another sticking point. So in March of 1642, Charles actually declares war against the opposing members of Parliament, and civil war results. And you have two sides in the English Civil War. You got the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. And how do you remember them? Well, the Cavaliers, if you think about the King Charles Cavalier Spaniel, that's the dog that Charles II over here on the right. This is Charles II. This is Oliver Cromwell. This is John Locke up here. Isaac Newton at the bottom. John Locke is at the bottom and the top. Who is this guy right here, though? I don't know who that is. Anyhow, so Charles II, he used to have all those dogs, and they're called King Charles Cavalier Spaniel. He's Charles II, though. Remember that. So Charles I is who we're talking about here, and they are the Cavaliers. The supporters of Charles I are the Cavaliers. The king, the clergy, Anglican Church, the more conservative traditional people are going to be Cavaliers. Majority of the old gentry, the old nobility from the north and from the west. Those are the Cavalier side. And you got the Roundheads. The Roundheads are the Calvinists, and they were known for that because of the style of cap that they wore was round, or helmet that they wore was round. They opposed the king. Obviously, the more radical Calvinists in Parliament were the ones that were being treated so badly in the first place, and they allied themselves actually with Scotland in return for guarantees that Presbyterianism would be imposed on England after the war. And so they were supported by Presbyterian-dominated London. The people who were mostly making up the Roundheads are going to be businessmen, some nobles in the south and east, and they had the support of the Navy and the merchant marine as well. And this is where we see Oliver Cromwell come in. You guys might remember the story of Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army. Okay, Charles I surrendered to the Scots in 1646. But then we see a division between Puritans and Presbyterians. Okay, Puritans are English Calvinists, Presbyterians are Scottish Calvinists, developed late, and basically Cromwell refused. What does this say? It's kind of a refused some sort of call to disband them. The idea being here that Oliver Cromwell is a military leader, and he tries to set up the Commonwealth of England, where England is going to be a republic style of government. But you see a division form under Cromwell where the Puritans and the Presbyterians don't get along as well. In 1648, you see something called Pride's Purge. This is where Parliament debated restoring Charles I to the throne at that point. The New Model Army removed all non-Puritans from Parliament, leaving what was called a rump parliament on hand, which is like a skeleton crew of people that only supported Cromwell. So he dismisses anyone who doesn't support him. And the rump parliament was the one that put Charles I on trial for treason and finds him guilty. So he gets beheaded. Charles I gets beheaded in 1649, and this effectively ends the English Civil War, but in some sense, actually, the problems are only beginning. This is the first time that we've seen the European king in our class get executed. It would not be the last, though. New factions emerged demanding reforms under the Cromwell era. So levelers were religious radical revolutionaries who sought more social and political reforms. They wanted a more egalitarian society. Think about what that means, level things out, almost like levelers, the people who wanted a level, even society. They were more radical. You have the Diggers, who denied Parliament's authority and rejected private ownership of land altogether. And then you have the Quakers, who were very similar to the Anabaptists. They have more pacifist views. They also allowed women in clergy. They were also anti-slavery and various other things early on. So the Quakers are also considered really radical. So we're seeing new factions of very radical Puritans develop at this time. This period of time between kings is called in the interregnum, the period of time between Charles I and Charles II, where interregnum, which refers to between reigns of kings, rule with no king. The Commonwealth gets established in 1649, but in reality, this is basically a military dictatorship with the best army in Europe at that time. And Scottish Presbyterians proclaimed Charles II as the new king, and Cromwell once again defeated a Scottish invasion. So Cromwell's doing pretty well for himself, setting up the Protectorate. He became Lord Protector, in effect a Puritan dictatorship. He dissolves the Rump Parliament even after a series of disputes with them. So England then at that point gets divided into 12 districts and so on and so forth, and I'm getting into too much detail here, but basically these are some of the things that Cromwell did during this period of time where England doesn't have a king. You have strict Puritan rule that regulated the morality of England at this time as well. Press was heavily censored, sports were prohibited, theaters get closed down. It's a very rigid militaristic society. It's not like a true republic, but then it's also super radical. They're doing this for the first time ever, a period of time without having a king at all in England. And then eventually, 1658, Oliver Cromwell dies, but his son Richard was not as good and basically was ineffective. And at that point, the Stuarts restore Charles II. to the throne, or Parliament restores rather the Stuarts under Charles II to the throne in 1660, and that's what we call the Restoration. So Cavalier Parliament restored Charles II in 1660. Now, while in exile, he agreed to abide by Parliament's decisions. Here's a guy who thought there was a chance he could never be king, but he gets called in to kind of take over, and they say, look, it's on one condition, and that's that you abide by Parliament's decisions. The second you don't do that, you're going to be in trouble. So Parliament was stronger in relation to the king than ever before in England, and that's really what we're talking about when we talk about constitutionalism, is reducing the power of the king to this lawmaking body, this legislative body of Parliament in England. So the king's power after the English Civil War is far from absolute, and Charles II grants religious toleration as well, and then you see the development of the start of political parties in England from that point on, which is the Whigs, who eventually down the line become the Liberal Party, and then the Conservative Party, the Tories, who favored James II even after he was deposed. James II is the younger brother of Charles II. He's the guy who takes over, and he's Catholic, and then they take him off and they replace him with his daughter. Clarendon Code of 1661, this is where monarchists and Anglicans targeted Puritans. The Test Act of 1673 forbade non-Anglicans from voting, etc., etc. Charles II seemed partial to Catholicism and drew criticism from the Whigs in Parliament, who had a tendency to be more anti-Catholic. And then the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, the Whig Parliament sought to limit Charles's power. The provisions of the Habeas Corpus Act basically said that this enabled judges to demand that prisoners be in court during their trials. So, like I said, present the body, right? Habeas corpus, you have to show up to your trial. The body must be presented. It can't just be a trial done in absence, or in absentia, I think is what they call it. Required just cause for continued imprisonment, and provided for speedy trials, and again forbade double jeopardy. And a lot of these precedents are things that we again have in our modern day legal judicial system. Charles took control of Scotland. Scotland gained its independence in 1660, and Charles went back on his 1651 pledge that acknowledged Presbyterianism in Scotland and declared himself the head of the Church of Scotland. And he was trying to once again impose Anglican hierarchy in the church, and thousands were killed for resisting Charles's dictatorship there. James II was the last of the Stuarts. He sought to make England Catholic again, and it does not go over well. He is taken off of the throne and replaced with his daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange. And the final act in the struggle for political sovereignty in England is where we see the Glorious Revolution of 1888, which is where James II is taken off of the throne and forced to abdicate, and this is where Mary and William of Orange take over. James abdicated and fled to France, and this is the crest of King William III and Queen Mary II, who is a Protestant that Parliament liked and accepted officially a constitutional monarchy in England, and that's where we see the signing of the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Which was written by Parliament and then accepted by William III of England and Mary II, and England became officially at that point a constitutional monarchy, which became the hallmark for constitutionalism in Europe. It's the first time that we've seen a constitutional document or constitutional monarchical style government in place in Europe ever. And so the Petition of Right, Habeas Corpus, all of these become part of the English Constitution. King could not be Catholic. Laws can only be made with the consent of Parliament. The parliamentary members had the right of free speech in Parliament, but not outside Parliament. No standing army in peacetime without parliamentary approval, and then taxation was illegal without parliamentary approval. So also no excessive bail, no cruel and unusual punishment, trial by jury, right to bear arms, but not Catholics. And then free elections to Parliament, people had the right to petition. So all of these, again, are very, very similar to the kinds of things that we see as precedences in our own. Now, I want to be clear. This revolution, although it creates a constitutional monarchy, this is not a democratic revolution. Okay, power remains firmly in the hands of the nobles. And you don't get to be elected into your noble position. You are just born into your noble position. And that remains the case in England all the way up through the mid-1800s. So I want to stress that although we are talking about a constitutional monarchy where parliamentarians' rights are guaranteed to a degree, and freedom of speech is guaranteed in Parliament, remember that the people who make up Parliament are going to be nobles. And so these people are privileged members of society who have exclusive right to governance. We are simply talking about the balance of governing power between parliamentarians and the king, where in most places in Europe that are centralized at this point, by, like, for example, France, have absolute power resting in a single central figure of a monarch. So, most notable defense of the Glorious Revolution came from the political philosopher John Locke, who wrote his second treatise of civil government in 1690, and he stated that the people created government to protect their natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and that it is the role of the government to defend those, and if the government demonstrates it is unable to defend life, liberty, and property, it is the right of the people to overthrow that government and replace it with one that is not tyrannical. This is the political basis for the American Revolution down the line as well. Toleration Act of 1689 granted the right to worship for Protestant nonconformists like Puritans and Quakers, but they were not allowed to hold office, and these religious liberties do not extend to Catholics, Jews, or Unitarians, but they are largely left alone during this time. The Act of Settlement of 1701 provided the guidelines for succession once the Protestant Stuarts had passed on, and Act of Union, 1707. This is where we see the unification of England and Scotland into Great Britain. So after 1707 is when we can use the term British. Pre-1707, we use the word English or Scottish to refer to either of those places. All right, anatomy of the Revolution. You're going to see that once again this matches what we talked about with the French Revolution. So you see this old regime, revolution run by moderates, radicals take things to an extreme, and then you see it kind of a swing back to the other way, conservative. So it kind of does one of these things. It does a giant hook. It starts off with the old regime, like in France, or where conservatives and royalists are in power. Then we see a revolution that gets run by moderates. That's kind of like the National Assembly in the French Revolution, and in this case it's like the Puritans and the Presbyterians. Then radicals take things to an extreme. In the English Civil War, that's like Cromwell. In the French Revolution, that's going to be more like, Maximilien Robespierre when he tries to create a radical Republican style government. And then what happens eventually? People get sick of the fear and terror, and that radical sentiment eventually wears off and gives way to, once again, a more moderate move away from the extreme. This is where we get into the Protectorate era. Maybe you could think of this as more like the Directory years in France, and then the Restoration, which is the return of conservatives to power. Now, in France, that of course happens later on down the line when they restore, say, like Charles X to power or something like that. But it does go back conservative. Even in Napoleon's time, things are quite conservative, and France is being run more or less by an individual leader. English cabinet system of the 18th century, prime minister. The first prime minister ever is Sir Robert Walpole, and he led the cabinet from 1721 to 1742. The early Hanoverian kings, so we're in a new dynasty, the Hanover dynasty, the Hanoverian kings. George I rules from, so we see Queen Anne until 1714, and then George I, George II, okay, and then the one that you may be more familiar with is George III. He was the king. George III was king of England when the American Revolution breaks out. Not to be confused with like George Washington or anyone like that. Two totally different people. But George III was the Hanoverian king who was the leader of Britain during the American Revolution. Okay, Dutch Republic, first half of the 17th century, we talked about the Dutch Golden Age. Basically, we're seeing a government run by the bourgeois class in the Dutch Republic. Government was basically represented at, what is this? Government was run by Represent Institute. I don't know what that means there, but anyhow, it's a much more representative style government than a lot of places in Europe. It's kind of the thing that's so weird about the Dutch Republic is that they kind of they don't even really initially set off having like a republican style of government, but they kind of against their best efforts, or contrary to their best efforts, of trying to create a more absolutist monarchical style government, they end up having an unusual form of government where power kind of switches between a bourgeois assembly and what's called a stadtholder. And the stadtholder was essentially like a I guess a prime minister of sorts, but anyhow, or a king, I guess you could say. But the point being that that these two bodies would have typically kind of go back and forth in terms of ruling. Rembrandt, one of the best known Dutch Golden Age artists. This is Masters of the Cloth Guild. Famous portrait shows middle class leaders of a guild conducting business. Industriousness, emblematic of the industriousness of the Calvinist burghers in the Netherlands. Remember that the Calvinists are, the Dutch Reformed Church is a big center of Calvinism, and they're going to be those guys who wear these dark, wide brim hats with these white, like collar things, and long black clothing. So anytime that you see this, think the Dutch. Okay. Stadtholder, like I said, a governor, military leader. Yeah, he's like a governor. That's the best way of describing. He's not really a king. He's like a governor, I guess, is the best way of explaining his position. So the government was considered. There's 7 provinces in the Dutch Republic. The largest one is Holland. That's where Amsterdam is. They have the more influence, okay? And during times of crisis, all 7 provinces would elect the same stadtholder, usually from the House of Orange. And so religious toleration, Calvinism was the dominant religion, but there was a split between the Dutch Reformed Church, who were the traditional Calvinists, and the Arminians in the Dutch Republic. Now remember, Arminianism is like Calvinism light. It's Calvinism, but without the prospect of predestination. So Arminians did enjoy full rights after 1632. There was toleration of Catholics and Jews, but they had fewer rights, and toleration enabled a cosmopolitan society that promoted trade in the Dutch Republic. They had a tendency to be a little bit more religiously tolerant after the Dutch Golden Age. Netherlands became the greatest mercantile nation of the 17th century. Amsterdam became the banking and commercial center of all of Europe, replacing Antwerp as being one of the most important ports, particularly in Northern Europe. The Dutch had to rely on commerce because it had very few natural resources. Remember that the Low Countries are called that not because of where they are, in terms of direction. They're called the Low Countries because they have very low, sea level. And so they have a tendency to be marshy lands that are swampy and fill quickly with water and stuff. And so anyhow, the Dutch had several outstanding seaports, but they had to come up with clever ways of draining these fields and reclaiming the land from these marshy areas. They did not have governmental controls and monopolies that interfered with free enterprise. The Dutch are kind of like very progressive in an unusual way, having broken away from Spanish control late in the 1500s. Fishing was a key industry to them, but they also have several industries like textiles, furniture, fine woolen goods, sugar refinery, tobacco cutting, brewing, pottery, glass. It's quite a diverse economy, and this same diverse economy lends itself to, later on down the line, English colonies over in America particularly the Massachusetts Bay Colony, have very similar kinds of, not all the same, but very similar kinds of industries that allow for that economy to be very capitalist and very profitable and egalitarian in a way. Lots of access to wealth and stuff. The Dutch East India Company and Dutch West India Company were both organized as cooperative ventures between the state and private enterprise, the idea being that wealthy people could pool their funds together to create some sort of joint stock company that would allow them to go and set up endeavors at trading posts in other places around the world. So the East India Company would go to places that previously the Portuguese had taken over, like Sri Lanka, parts of Indonesia, parts of India, ports in Africa. That was the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch West India Company goes, as you can imagine, west. They go more to places like the Caribbean, Latin America, even some places in West Africa. Okay, so the Dutch East India Company is operating mostly in the Indian Ocean or even the Western Pacific Ocean. The Dutch West India Company is going to be operating mostly in the Atlantic, and then maybe even in the Caribbean as well. Jan Vermeer, view of Delft. This is 1660 to 61, shows Vermeer's bustling hometown. Foreign policy: Netherlands gained gained their independence after the 30 Years' War. England's navigation laws and the conquest of Dutch New Netherlands weakened the Dutch economy at this time. Remember that France and England both have wars with the Dutch in the time period of Louis XIV and in the late 1600s. And these wars with France and England prove really, really ruinous to the Dutch, and it ends their golden age. And that's really when we see the Treaty of Utrecht is signed at the end of 1713. That's after the War of Spanish Succession. And this marks the end of the Dutch Golden Age. We talked about King Gustavus Adolphus. He was killed in the Battle of Lutzen in the 30 Years' War. We talked about him last class. Sweden is struggling with Russia at this point. But basically the Baltic region came under Swedish domination, and Sweden became a world power during this time, thanks to the leadership of Gustavus Adolphus in the early part of the 1600s. But he does get killed, and thereafter Sweden finds itself in a position where it is squabbling with Russia over lands in the northeast there, part of Europe, Baltic region. Okay, so that brings us to the end of constitutionalism. Hopefully that answered some questions for you about constitutionalism. At this point, is there any questions that you guys have for me about what we're doing? Ouch. Is anyone even still watching? I should probably check to see if anyone's even still in here. 17 people. Wow, we have more people. Nice. Spilled coffee. Oh dear. Questions, comments? Let's change up the assignment for today. Let's do this. I'm going to pull this up here. No questions? All right, folks. Hey, Mr. Knight, animal population is starting to increase around the world, and also sittings. And also sittings. What does it mean? Sorry, Vig, I don't know what's and also sittings mean. Starting to increase around. I'm I'm trying to get this thing pulled up here so you guys can do this. Let's see if we can get this to work. Do. Oh, maybe he means sightings. Maybe he meant to type sightings. Also sightings. Hey, Cousin Jeevan. Good to see you. Welcome. I'm trying to get this thing pulled up here. I guess we'll just do this one. I can't get this other one to work right now. But, let's just do this. We're going to sign this here. Let's do this. Assign as homework. Sign in. Sign up with Google. Let's do this. We're going to go to this one. Nice. Okay. Learners should complete the quiz by what today is. The 15th. Let's do the 17th at 8 a.m. Okay. Host game. Nice. And we're going to assign this and we're going to share a link to copy to Schoology. How about this? This is fun. This is a fun little thing. I have never done this before. This is going to be cool. All right, so we're going to do a quizzes for your homework for this time, because why not change it up a little bit? I'm kind of limited in my ability to assign work here, so I'm trying to come up with things that are like, I don't know, marginally entertaining for you to do, or at least helpful. So let me put this into our folder for today, and pretty much all you'll have to do is just do it and take a screenshot and put it up on the folder. So let's do this. Let's go here. Lesson 5, Wednesday, April 15. Oops. Okay. Create. And then we'll take and put the link to the video in here. So that people have access to that. How many questions in this quiz? There's 30 questions. So the Dutch during their golden age would be called a constitutional monarchy as well. Yeah, I guess kind of. So they're not really a traditional constitutional monarchy. They're kind of like a constitutional monarchy by accident in a way. But yeah, they're more constitutional than other places for sure. Okay, so we're going to do this. Let's copy that video URL, and then we're going to enter this here, title that there. Wait, live lecture, April 15th. And remember that today's review was all on constitutionalism. We are not done with reviewing this unit, though. I might even split this into 3 sections, because it took me a solid hour just to talk about constitutionalism with you guys. So I'm thinking that it's probably going to take me about an hour and a half to talk about absolutism. So that'll be on Friday, just in Western absolutism. And then we'll talk about Eastern absolutism, which will have to do with Russia and stuff. Maybe on Monday. But we're coming up through the rest of the review here. Let's do this. I'm going to add this link here as well. This will be the actual assignment for today. It's just 30 questions on absolutism. This is all stuff we've covered before. There may be some questions that weren't directly covered in today's lecture on there, but that really is neither here nor there. Let's do this, because all of this stuff is all review anyway, so you should have all this stuff. This is all just for the sake of practice, just exposure to content. So to me, it makes no difference if the questions are have some things to do with absolutism or not, because it's all from the same unit, so we all need to know it, so may as well practice it anyway. Here's the quizzes. Quizzes assignment. How do you spell quizzes? Q-I-Z-Z. Okay. And then quizzes, absolutism, constitutionalism questions. Okay, we'll do that, and then I'll put a full an assignment up there. If you could just do me a favor, so that, because it just helps me organize things, you could just put this up here on. You can submit a screenshot of what you did on the quizzes, and then that'll serve as the proof that you did the assignment. So I'm going to put this up here. Do add assignment, screenshot your final score, and submit that image to this on Schoology. So quizzes, final score screenshot, because this helps me keep things organized. Ungraded. All right. And then I'm going to copy this folder now over to the other classes on Schoology, the other courses, periods 0 and 2. There should now, let's do this, copy to course. We got to go over to this side. We got to go here and here. Okay, cool. So yeah, today, a little bit shorter lesson today in terms of things, but like I said, I'm dividing this up, so it's kind of shorter because I'm only doing one part of it today and focusing only on the constitutional side, and then we'll focus on Western absolutism on Friday. How many questions in the quizzes? 30 questions. I think it should be pretty doable for you. All right, folks. Well, that pretty much brings us to the end of what I wanted to cover today to review absolutism, which was rule of the Stuart kings, divine right, English Civil War, Cromwell, and the Dutch Republic. So that covers everything that I wanted to go over today. You can do the quizzes and get your points. Oh, some people, I was going to mention this. Some people have been a little bit concerned that maybe the 5 points per assignment isn't going to make a major difference in your grade. If I find that 5 points per assignment isn't bringing your grades up the way that I want it to, then I will weigh those heavier so that it has more of an impact. Because I think some people message me, they're like, hey, I did like 2 or 3 assignments and my grade only went up by like 0.2% or whatever. So if it's not having a measurable impact on your grade by the time that we get to like 6, 7, 8, 10 assignments that we've done from distance instruction, I'll just go back and make them all worth twice as much, and then it'll have more of an impact on your grade. I don't want it to have an unfair impact on your grade, but I want it to have enough where you have an incentive to keep doing it and keep studying and following along with what we do here. So there could be a chance that I go back and I make those assignments worth more points, just so that you guys can feel like, hey, I'm doing work here. How come it's not really having an effect? All right. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions on any of that? I'm going to type it out too, just so you guys can see, because I'm on delay. All right, very good, folks. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, and I have to get ready here to do my world history online instructions. So, with that, I will leave you guys all to it and get those assignments done. All right, folks. See ya.